If I ask you to name the designers who built the blueprint for some of the biggest new trends right now, could you do it? And here's the uncomfortable part. If you can't, it might not be because the history doesn't exist. It's because someone decided that it didn't matter enough to preserve. Black fashion isn't just a vibe. It's not just streetwear. It's not just something that the culture does and the industry profits from. It's archive-worthy history, and too often that history gets treated like it's disposable, like it's seasonal, like it's only valuable until the next trend cycle hits. And that should make you pause, because if our style legacy isn't documented, credited, or protected, what happens next? Who gets remembered and who gets erased? Who gets paid? Who gets studied? Who gets museum space? Well, we're going to be talking about Black fashion archives and why preserving our style legacy matters beyond seasonal trends. We're going to get into how iconic Black style becomes mainstream without the receipts, why the mainstream fashion industry keeps forgetting us on purpose or by design. We're also going to talk about the quiet power of the archive, the photographs, the magazines, sketches, flyers, salon posters, runway footage, and family albums that prove we were always here, and what it looks like right now to reclaim the narrative before the culture gets repackaged yet again. So stay with me, because by the end of the video, you're going to look at fashion and the trends very, very differently. Now, you might not realize that some of what you've been sold as new is actually a theft with good lighting. So the truth that nobody likes to say out loud is that fashion is curated and politics decide what gets kept. We grow up thinking fashion history is objective, like it's just dates and designers and icons. But fashion history is not neutral. It's selected, and the selection is power. Archives, official ones that is, often come with gatekeepers, institutions, editors, museum boards, collectors, auction houses, and academic departments. And historically, they have not treated Black fashion as high value unless it's filtered through a mainstream lens. Now, if Black fashion is always framed as influence, but rarely as authorship, then what's the real agenda here? Because influence can be celebrated without accountability, but authorship requires credit, context, and compensation. So when Black style gets reduced to urban, street, cool, edgy, or trend setting, it sounds like a compliment, but it can also be a way to avoid calling it what it is, innovation. And innovation deserves a paper trail. Seasonal trends move fast, but erasure moves faster. Fashion has one of the shortest memory spans of any industry on the planet. Trends churn so quickly that last year feels like a different era. But here's the anxiety trigger. When the cycle moves this fast, it becomes easier to rewrite the origin of the story. A silhouette becomes revived. A hairstyle becomes discovered. A print becomes reimagined. And suddenly, the people who originated it are nowhere in the story. Now, you've seen it. A style shows up in the community first, then the runway validates it later. A look is labeled costume on Black bodies and fashion forward on everybody else. A trend gets renamed, it gets sanitized and sold back to us at luxury prices like we weren't already wearing it in the first place. So the industry often acts like Black people are the mood board, not the makers. And that's why archives matter, because archives are the receipts that stop people from playing right in our face. What counts as an archive is bigger than a museum. When people hear archive, they imagine white gloves and climate-controlled rooms. But Black fashion archives often live in places in mainstream history that gets ignored. ignored. Things like family photo albums with Sunday best and prom looks that tell a whole story. Old beauty shop posters, church programs, and neighborhood event flyers. Remember those? Black magazines, catalogs, and ads that documented style in real time. Runway tapes, behind the scenes footage, designer sketches, and fabric swatches. Oral histories, because sometimes our elders are the only record that's actually left. Now, what if the most important fashion archive isn't in a museum, but in somebody's auntie's closet? How about that? And that's not a joke. That's the point. So Black communities have always preserved style through memory, through tradition, through passing it down. But when institutions don't collect it, the legacy becomes fragile. It becomes vulnerable to being lost, misattributed, or stolen. So the archive isn't just storage, it's protection. The origins of Black fashion isn't a trend, it's a timeline. Black fashion has never been one thing. It's not one aesthetic. It's a long, complex timeline shaped by survival, resistance, celebration, and migration, as well as economics, music, politics, spirituality, and joy. Now, there are entire cultural moments where Black style was speaking louder than words, dressing as dignity in a world trying to deny it, dressing as a protest, dressing as self-definition, dressing as aspiration, dressing as identity. When the mainstream compresses all of that into street style, it strips the message. They don't just look to take the look, they look to take the meaning. That's why we need archives that don't just show what we wore, but explain why we wore it and what it meant in that era, in that neighborhood, and in that moment. Because without context, history becomes decoration. The designers and makers, the names we should know, but we were never taught. There are Black designers who pioneered silhouettes, business models, and aesthetics that shaped entire markets, yet their names aren't spoken without the same reverence. And here's where it gets uncomfortable yet again. When Black designers aren't archived, it's easier for the industry to pretend they were never exceptions and not foundational. Systemic bias shows up in who gets investment and distribution. We all know that. Who gets press and editorial coverage, who gets museum retrospectives, and who gets academic study. Who gets the label genius versus influencer? Well, if you don't have an archive, the world can act like you never existed. That's why preserving sketches and lookbooks and invoices, photos, interviews, and behind-the-scenes documentation matters. So it's not just sentimental, it's strategic, because documentation becomes legitimacy in systems that demand proof of your own brilliance. Now, the good news here is that people are pushing back. More Black archivists, more Black historians, collectors, stylists, photographers, and scholars are doing the work that the mainstream neglected. Digitizing old magazines and runway footage, documenting street style properly with names, dates, and context, preserving designer collections and their oral histories. Building community archives that don't require institutional permission to be valid. And this movement matters also because then it shifts the power from they recognized us to we documented ourselves. Now, that's the difference between being included and owning the narrative, because inclusion is temporary. Ownership lasts. What we lose when we don't preserve it, and what do we gain when we do? Well, when Black fashion history isn't archived, we lose credit, we lose wealth, we lose legal proof of authorship, cultural clarity, generational pride, and the ability to teach our own story properly. When we preserve it, we gain a documented legacy and stronger pathways for Black designers to be recognized and protected, educational tools for future generations, and a cultural mirror that reflects us accurately, but not as a trend, but as architects. So if we don't keep our own receipts, somebody else will rewrite the story again. And the rewrite always benefits the same people. Here's the takeaway. Black fashion is not seasonal. It's not a trend. It's not something that emerges every few years like a big surprise. Black fashion is history in motion, and archives are how we make sure that the world can't pretend that it didn't happen, because once the trend cycle moves on, what's left is the record. And if the record doesn't include us, it's not history. It's propaganda with pretty pictures. I want to leave you with this question. What parts of Black style have you loved your whole life that you never seen credited properly? And what archive do you personally have to access when it comes to photos, memories, family pieces, old magazines, church hats, prom looks, salon stories that could keep the legacy alive? If this video hit a nerve, comment on one Black fashion moment or style legacy that you think deserves to be preserved with the names attached. Share this with someone that always says they're doing what we've been doing, and subscribe, because this series is about keeping the receipts and not letting the culture get erased in silence. Because when we preserve our style, we preserve our story, and our story is not up for deletion. I'm going to see you in the next one, and thank you for stopping by the Occasional Commentary. If you found any value in this video, please, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.